Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of Joe Boyd, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Has just written a book that's been published, And the Roots of Rhythm Remain. This has come out on Faber and Faber. He's had a long, very long history in music, dating back right to the early or mid-60s. Yes, with the UFO Club, which was very exciting, and also working with Pink Floyd, Nick Drake, and lots of other people. But you'll find out all about that in this fascinating interview. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Joe, it's over to you.
It was very well. There was a moment in, I guess, around 1953 when I was about 11, when my grandmother, I had one grandmother who was very musical, who was a concert pianist. So I loved music, and I used to sit under the piano and listen to her play Chopin and all of that. But then my other grandmother, who was completely unmusical, just wanted to get me a Christmas present or a birthday present or something, and walked into a record store and asked what she should get some young fellow who's interested in all this kind of strange black music and things. And so she walked out of the store with a compilation called the Encyclopedia of Jazz.
Right.
On RCA Victor, which had Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Fletcher Henderson, just one fantastic track after the next. And in the middle of the second side, a blues by Sleepy John Estes, which completely mesmerized me. And so I became kind of equally obsessed with blues and jazz from that point on.
Yes, my God, that was your bit. And then educationally, did you then go to Harvard University to study?
I did. I went there. And, to be honest, I didn't do a lot of studying. I kind of, everybody at Harvard was very keen to get into the best graduate schools and get their PhDs. And I was kind of more interested in the Club 47.
Right.
The local folk club in Harvard Square, and listening to music. And so I just coasted through, and they, in the humanities, you wrote a lot of papers, and knowing that people were desperate to get A's so that they could get into a good grad school. If the grader said, "Oh, this guy hasn't done his work, he doesn't know what he's talking about, I'll stick it to him, I'll give him a C," which was terrible if you wanted to be a grad student.
Right.
But for me, it was just fine. I just kind of coasted through, taking seriously a few courses.
Yes.
That I was interested in, but mostly being obsessed with music.
Yes. And did you become a beatnik at this stage? Was the beat, Ginsberg, Caro?
That was sort of in the rearview mirror. Beats were 50s. And by the time I was going down to the folk club, there were the sort of nascent hippies, people who smoked dope instead of shooting heroin, who were interested in folk music more than jazz. There was a sort of in-between time between beatniks and hippies. And I don't know what we called ourselves, but there was quite a few of that ilk around Harvard Square.
I guess Freaks wasn't quite invented by then, had they? And,
which?
Freaks hadn't been
Freaks.
sort of...
No.
That was later on. So what was the reason for coming to the UK, actually? You came, was it 64 you were sort of coming
I
to...
came there as a tour manager for... I I really wanted to go to Europe. I think my grandmother, the piano-playing grandmother, she had studied in Vienna with one of the great teachers and worked in Berlin as an assistant to Arthur Schnabel, who was one of the great pianists and teachers. And she had on 2 occasions come home to America to get married. The first husband died, and then she did it again with another husband. and I think she always felt that it was kind of a mistake. And there was sort of an assumption, and I took piano lessons from her. There was sort of an assumption that America was a land of barbarians and that the real culture was across the ocean.
Yes.
So I loved maps and airline schedules and the idea of traveling. And so I determined I would do it. And I was very fortunate when I sort of was planning to just go to Europe and survive however I could. I got offered a job as a tour manager with Muddy Waters, which was at a Tharp, Brownie McGee and Sonny Terry. And we went to Britain and it was just great. It was like 1964. All the sort of young rock bands were turning out to concerts like this.
Yes.
And people were queuing up to get Muddy Waters' autograph like he was a huge star. And in America, nobody was interested. So I decided I'd like to stay in Britain because the audiences were so much hipper.
Yes, at that stage. So then you develop, because obviously 64, 65, the summer of love was still a few years away. So how did you then discover people like Barry Miles and John Hoppy Hopkins and that kind of scene? How did that develop?
Perfectly lucky in a way. I mean, when I was with Muddy Waters, Melody Maker was doing a story on the tour. And Hoppy at that time was a photographer. And they sent him down to the Fairfield Halls, Croydon, to take pictures of the group during our sound check. And Hoppy and I hit it off immediately, and I got him tickets for a show the following week in Hammersmith at the Hammersmith Odeon. And after the tour was over, I looked him up and we started hanging out together. And then I ran out of money. I wanted to stay on because I had another tour, a jazz tour coming in the autumn, if I could last. So I slept on Hoppy's sofa for weeks on end, and we became pals.
Yes, and that's kind of how it all started. So how did UFO, whose idea was the UFO club that was established?
Well, Hoppy and I both at about the same time had found ourselves in a similar situation. I'd come back to England working for Elektra Records, opening their London office. And in September of 66, I got fired. And Hoppy, by that time, was just starting the International Times.
Right.
And he decided the only way he could make it work was to drop all of his photography and just focus on producing the paper. And so both of us were suddenly without a regular income and not really knowing how we would pay our rent. And he had thrown a fantastic party at the Roundhouse for the launch of the International Times.
Was this the 14-hour Technicolor Dream?
No. That was something else. That was 6 months later.
Right.
This was the launch of International Times at the Roundhouse. And the groups that performed were Soft Machine and Pink Floyd. And it was a great party. And everybody, it was a cross section of street people and revolutionaries and Marianne Faithfull and Mick Jagger and John Lennon. And all mixture of celebrities and freaks and all kinds of things.
Was
And
Caroline cream cheese there?
Susie Cream Cheese.
Oh, Susie, not Caroline.
Susie Cream Cheese, yeah. I'm not sure she had arrived by then. She came a bit later, a few months later, I think.
Right,
Um, and there were two Susie Cream Cheeses. The one that ended up becoming Hoppy's girlfriend was a fake Susie Cream Cheese.
right. Oh,
There was a woman called Pamela Zarubica who actually came to London at a certain point a little bit later, who was the original Susie Cream Cheese on the Frank Zappa record.
yes.
Anyway, but so we've just decided, let's try and do something commercially along the lines of the party
Hmm.
that Hoppy had just thrown. And so we just went into partnership and found a Irish dance hall in Tottenham Court Road and handed out some leaflets, and people showed up.
It happened. It
And it was
happened.
great. Yeah.
Yes, because did you feel that year, 67, like in San Francisco at Golden Gate Park, they had the gathering of the tribes with people like, Timothy Leary and Ginsberg and members of the Grateful Dead and Country Joe. And then that was January time. And then in June, July, they had Ali Pali, the 14-hour Technicolor Dream. Was that?
Well, 14 hours, that was in April.
Oh, was it April?
Yeah. And that was in response to what happened was it was pretty, the whole scene was pretty underground for a while. It had the benefits for the London Free School with Pink Floyd had started in the autumn of 66. And UFO drew good crowds, but there weren't queues outside. And then in March, Arnold Lane was released, which is a record I'd produced, but it was the last thing I did with Pink Floyd. And it got into the charts, and suddenly there was this huge surge of people coming down to UFO and queuing outside. And the police got freaked out. And because suddenly it was like, too many people dressing weird and
Right.
smoking dope and everything. And so they actually raided the International Times and the Indica bookshop offices. International Times was located in the basement of Indica, and confiscated all the account books. And so International Times had no idea which news agents owed them money for papers they'd sold, and it was a terrible blow.
Yes.
And so they put on the 14-hour Technicolor Dream to raise money. So I wasn't involved in that. That was something that Miles and Hoppy did to raise money for International Times.
Right. But that was 67, wasn't it? The Summer of Love. Did you feel when you were watching, or that evening and then watching the sunrise the next morning, did you feel that the counterculture, something was magical happened?
It felt huge. It felt like the wind was really shifting. I mean, it was really quite momentous. And then in June, Sergeant Pepper came out, and that made you feel like everything we had been, I don't know, that sort of spirit of experimentation and freedom was now mainstream.
Yes.
And then the Monterey Pop Festival happened 2 weeks later, and that sort of took the San Francisco scene mainstream. And so there was a sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was triumphant, but on the other hand, it spoiled everything, because suddenly every promoter in London was putting on light shows.
Right.
And it was no longer something unique to us at UFO. It was mainstream, big money was involved, and crowds of people who weren't necessarily interested in countercultural ideas or movements or politics, or they just wanted to have a good time.
Yes.
And LSD, which had been viewed as kind of a sacrament, suddenly became a way to get hammered. And so there was this change between March and September of 67. You could say that the whole thing turned a bit sour.
Yes, my God. And then towards the end, you had Charles Manson, Altamont,
Yeah.
and obviously the death of then Brian Jones and Hendrix, Morrison, and Joplin. Then did you go to Woodstock then with the Incredible String Band at this stage?
In 69, 2 years later, yeah.
Right. And what was your involvement with the Incredible String Band? Were you managing and producing them at that stage?
I was their manager, their producer. I worked very closely with them. And that's, it's a haunting night, Friday night at Woodstock, because it was a fantastic atmosphere. It was before the sun had baked everybody into oblivion, and before the bad acid had, kind of
Yes.
spread throughout. And they were supposed to be on Joan Baez was the headliner. It was an acoustic Friday night, and they were supposed to be on second to last. And it started to rain. And they had started using amps and electric pickups on their instruments. And when the promoter said, well, you can come back tomorrow afternoon and play, and it's supposed to be clear, there's no rain tomorrow. And there was no covering for the stage, so that they couldn't have used their amps, they would have gotten electrocuted. And so we all decided, okay, let's come back tomorrow afternoon. And it was just such a big mistake, because the atmosphere the following afternoon, we followed canned heat. People were kind of out of their heads, boogieing in the dust.
Right.
It was the wrong atmosphere for the Incredible String Band. It just didn't work.
Yes.
And so they ended up not in the movie, not in the album. It just was such a shame.
Yes, my God, that's so. How did you? I mean, I did interviewed Barry Miles once and said, what happened to you in the 70s? Because obviously the 60s. He said, well, just most of us dropped out because we were just tired. We just wanted to get some rest, and somehow never got that traction again the following decade. How do you navigate? After being in the scene for 6 years, being so involved. Your 70s, what was that kind of like for you? Because obviously you start working with Nick Drake at this stage or somewhere down the line.
Well, I worked with Nick in the 60s. Signed him in 69, 68 actually, and then 69 we produced the first records. But I moved to California. I did get burned out. I kind of was ready for a change. I got a job with Warner Brothers, and I didn't withdraw. I tried very hard luckily I had some success as a record producer, but I really had decided that I would be a film producer. And I produced a documentary about Jimi Hendrix for Warner Brothers. And then I started developing projects, real dramas. And of course, none of them got made.
Right.
So it was, the development deals that never amount to anything. And so that's in a way how the new book came about, because after I wrote White Bicycles,
yes,
about the 60s, people would say to me, so when are you going to write the book about the 70s? And I'd say, I'm not. I don't have a good story to tell about the 70s. Nothing good happened to me in the 70s, and I don't have a overarching line of what happened in the 70s that I can draw some conclusions from. And actually, I know you've done a lot of interviews with people from the 70s and 80s.
Yes, that's my kind of decade. But, I met you at the V&A when they had that exhibition, So Now You Want a Revolution or something like that. And we had a quick interview, which I think you were doing quite a lot that day. So it was kind of interesting during that period. So I've always been interested in the 60s as well, just because it was a decade that was only, if you think about it, in the mid-70s, the Beatles had only just broke up, hadn't they? But
Yeah.
you never, we were just all on their solo albums at that stage, and people were getting lost in prog rock and heavy rock, and then there was punk. But before punk, you had that kind of R&B sound with Dr. Feelgood, as well as a certain Californian sound, wasn't there? Like, I suppose Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and Carole King. So, that kind of period was kind of interesting, but it took a long time for people, I think, to make the 70s seem quite groovy. It took a while, didn't it? Everyone was almost, oh, you missed the 60s, what a shame. But then it's like, wait a minute, 70s had some great sounds, but, the narrative wasn't quite as sexy, was it?
It wasn't. And in fact, it's in my new book which is about, global music and the roots of rhythm remain. I point to the late 70s as what opened the door to all this sound of African music and Cuban music and Balkan music and Indian music and all this stuff that became much more popular, because I felt it was like, as long as there was really good music happening in the 50s and 60s, rock, and there wasn't much need or urgency to find music outside our culture.
No.
But when punk and disco came along, the kind of people that had really relished, really the good the virtuosic records that were roots, and that sort of had a feel of blues and jazz and immediacy and all that. Those are the people that went out looking for Fela Kuti and looking for Youssou N'Dour and looking for Cuban music, because they found punk and disco so depressing,
Yes.
and glam rock as well.
Yeah, but what was interesting, because the book's a dense read, isn't it? But it was interesting because you start with probably one of those albums which becomes the go-to album of the 80s. And I suppose what I found, which is Paul Simon's Graceland, because when I was growing up a little bit during the period of the 80s, I was mixed with a group who were a bit older than me, and they had all been into Dylan, Van Morrison, that kind of 70s stuff. And then suddenly they get to an age where they stop buying and they're not interested in the new music. I was trying to push them, like, oh, listen to the Smiths, or listen to Julian Cope, or listen to Susan the Banshees, The Cure. And they were like, no, it was like trying to, they were like, they'd bitten into some sort of off, food or something like that. But then there was a couple of albums that came out during the 80s that suddenly those old hippies suddenly went, yeah. And Paul Simon was one, there was Tracy Chapman and Suzanne Vega, and suddenly everyone had those, alongside their Van Morrison albums. And it's interesting because you start with the Paul Simon and go into quite a lot of detail about Paul's kind of career going nowhere fast, to then suddenly developing this kind of album that everybody suddenly buys.
Yeah, I mean, it was really the opening gun for a whole movement that got called world music, and so I would say, yeah, I mean, you're right that Tracy Chapman and Suzanne Vega were important figures in that era, but what Paul Simon did was really open the door to African music and to Latin American music, Brazilian music, and to what then ended up being the Talking Heads, what they adapted from Afrobeat. And you had all these influences coming from abroad that, I mean, listen, I mean, it's all de gustibus non est disputandum. Everybody has their own taste. And there wasn't a lot in the late 70s and the 80s in British and American pop music that I really was drawn to. I mean, I was the cliched figure, looking abroad, much more interested in a Bulgarian wedding band than I
Yes.
was in, a new band from the Hacienda in Manchester.
Yes, it was quite interesting, and it's an amazing book in the sense that you go into so much detail of like the political side and the tribal side of these countries and sort of places, that it must have taken absolutely phenomenal amount of time for each of these. I think, are there 9 particular sections or
Yeah,
chapters?
yeah, 9
And
chapters.
each one could almost be a book in itself. So when did you start the project? You know, this, because it's
Well, I started it right after White Bicycles came out.
right.
When people would say to me, "When are you going to write the book about the '70s?" And I'd say, "No way." And I knew right away that what I would do is write a book about this, about music from abroad, from afar, and not, and also because people were treating world music like it was some new thing. And I knew that, you know, there had been a Latin dance craze in the '40s and a tango craze before World War One.
Yes.
And, you know, that the West, so-called West, had always been eager to gobble up stuff from afar, you know, that a little bit of Latin feeling, a little bit of African feeling, a bit of gypsy feeling in the music was always, I mean, you know, you go back in history as I do in the book, and, you know, I make the case that, you know, it was the Roma musicians in Europe that really inspired the Romantic movement. You know, Goethe's, one of his seminal works, is all about revering the gypsy lifestyle and the freedom and the, you know, this was the sort of the kernel from which the Romantic movement was born. And then you have, you know, you had all these dances that were so square, like people never touching, you know, in Europe. And all of a sudden, there's the sensuality of the waltz and the mazurka and all these things which came from the working class, from underneath, you know. But
Yes.
music is a story of inspiration for the middle classes and the upper classes coming from below and afar. And I was going to focus, this book is focused on the afar.
Because it kind of also helps because you've been so involved in it, because you started the Hannibal record label in 1980, is that right?
Yeah.
And what was the kind of during that period? I mean, it seemed a risky time to be starting a label like that.
Well, I've always believed, somebody wants to, I can't remember who described it as, every time you see a certain flow on the surface of the ocean or a river or a lake, you can bet that there's something flowing in the opposite direction way down
Right.
in the depths. And the idea for Hannibal was actually that, you know, I'd been very much part of Warner Brothers in the '70s, and, you know, they were making so much money, you know, and they you know, were selling so many Joni Mitchell and Neil Young and Carole King. And Carole King wasn't on Warner Brothers, but they were selling millions and millions of records. And so it was an easy thing for them to sign and promote Randy Newman and Van Dyke Parks and um, lots of not particularly commercial, you know, people, but who had Ry Cooder, you know, who had an audience.
Hmm.
And then by the end of the '70s, disco had sort of swept the board. You know, everybody was going for dance music, and people like Ry Cooder and Van Dyke Parks and all these people that I'd been around at Warner Brothers were out in the cold. They were looking for deals. And I went to Chris Blackwell at Islands and I said, you know, I think we could scoop up a lot of these artists that used to be on major labels and put them out on an independent label and do really well for an independent, you know, not selling
Yes.
1 million, but selling 30,000 or 50,000 or something. And he agreed. And so he gave me the money to start Hannibal, And we were lucky. We did have one of those successes with Richard and Linda Thompson, Shoot Out the Lights,
Right.
1982. That
Did
was
that
our big.
feature Meet Me on the Ledge?
Yeah.
Right.
No. It felt the famous that Meet on the Ledge was a Fairport track from
Right.
1968. Now, one of the tracks that people know very well from that is The Wall of Death. On the Wall of Death, it's as nearest to being free. Um, and anyway, that sold 150,000 records or something, and so it kind of gave us a bit of momentum. But by the middle 80s, that scene was it was hard. There was a lot of indie labels. A lot of the major labels had started imprints that were interested in, like Seymour Stein.
Right.
And people like that were signing lots of interesting artists, and REM, people I produced, REM and Mary Margaret O'Hara and 10,000 Maniacs were the sort of people that I had in mind that I would sign to Hannibal. But by the middle 80s, they were going with bigger independents that were funded by the majors.
Right.
And that's when I started putting out records from Africa and Spain and
Right.
Cuba. Because, you could put out a singer-songwriter in 1986 and say, oh, she's fantastic. Her songs are really great. And the reviewer will say, yeah, there's 10 other artists that were described in exactly the same way this week.
Right.
New releases. It was very crowded.
It was. But you had to have a USP because you mentioned Mary Margaret O'Hara, which suddenly made me, not many people know her, but she did an album called Miss America, didn't she?
Yeah.
And frankly, I thought this was
album.
It's cool, but God, I thought this was it, and then she disappears for the rest of her life. So there you go. Don't bet on my recommendations. God, that would be a disaster. But there was often the odd artists that would come through, like a blues artist, like Robert Cray during that time, got picked up by a mainstream kind of crowd, didn't they? But I guess you could have had about 50 other blues artists just as good, but they would have just not. They'd have fallen through the crack, and no one would have batted an eyelid.
Well, there were quite a few in those days. George Thorogood, had a moment. I'm trying to remember who else had.
Yes.
And a lot of the veterans were still around. John Lee Hooker and B.B. King were still releasing albums and selling well and playing the Fillmore and that kind of thing.
But it was the 80s that really kind of world music. I mean, do you find, and I always find it a bit tedious when people get a bit arsy about this idea that, you go into a record shop, there's world music, should it be, put it in a category? But then I thought the people who were wanting to buy it, that type of music, would just want to go into those racks and not look at, all the other kind of albums by rock bands.
I've said in when people ask, when journalists sort of criticize the term, I say, well, we weren't categorizing the music so much as we were categorizing the audience.
Yeah. Well,
it's
absolutely.
It was just a sheer fact of life. If you wanted to survive as an independent label, somebody who went in to a record store to buy Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan after hearing the remix, they are the sort of people who you could possibly sell, about Orchestra Baobab to, or a Cubanismo to, or a Susanna Baca, or a Musicash, or a Scandinavian fiddle record or something, because people who buy one sort of so-called world music would be ready to listen to something else from a different part of the world. And if you had them all broken up and scattered around the shop, as you said, they'd never find them.
It would be commercial suicide. So what happens then? I mean, for me in the 80s was then you had people like John Peel started playing a lot of music. Then you had WOMAD and Glastonbury. And then And it was things like the Bundu Boys. For me, I'm glad they get mentioned in
Yeah.
your book, actually, because they get, they bring this album out on a small label called Shabini, and suddenly, Peel's playing them all the time. They get sessions. They eventually get on a major label. They support Madonna, which is probably a bit bad. But I remember seeing them on a rainy night in Norwich, and then again at Glastonbury in '87, and they sort of capture a whole new audience, I
Yeah.
think, because it
No,
is kind of this suddenly WOMAD. And there was Real World Records, there was Earthworks, and there was, on the reggae front, you had Green Sleeves and Stern Records. So world music during the '80s absolutely explodes in all directions.
that's right. Yeah.
And and it was nice because you got a nice bit about the Kanda Bongo Man, don't you? You meet
Yeah.
him, which I think John Peel has said is the only artist he's ever danced to in his life. So that was
Well,
good.
that's
So
nice.
how did you get to work with Kanda Bongo?
Well, I saw him play at the venue. The GLC had a whole series. They sponsored a whole, like, 4, 5, 6 months of African concerts every other week or something like that. And all these groups would come over from Paris or fly in from Africa, whatever. And it was just incredible. It was great atmosphere and great music. And one of the ones I liked the most was Kanda. And and then, as you said, as you described, Andy Kershaw started playing the Bundu Boys, and they came to play the Town and Country in London. And I went to see them, and the crowd, it was packed, and the crowd was going crazy for them. And I thought, well, yeah, they're pretty nice, but they're not musically as exciting for me as some of those Congolese bands that I saw at the venue. I'd seen they had 3 different Congolese bands. And my favorite was Kanda Bongo Man. And I'd read somewhere that he lived in Paris. And so as I was leaving the Town and Country, I was thinking to myself, I got to go to Paris and track down Kanda and see if I can license his records, because I know he makes records for the African market, produces them in Paris. And so I was thinking this through in my head, like, when's the first time I can go to Paris and find Kanda Bongo Man? And I start to cross Kentish Town Road, and I just start to look one way to make sure I'm not getting run over. And there, standing next to me, is Kanda Bongo Man.
Blimey.
And I thought, wow, Kanda? Yeah. And so I met him the next day for coffee, and we did a deal. So that was, and I never worked with him in the studio, but because he made all his own records very, very well. But I helped put together tours of North America and Britain and Scandinavia. And I went with him to the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Fair, having, strong-armed Quint Davis into putting him on. And it was great. It was great.
Yes. And when because I think it was around chapter 4, you talk a lot about Ravi Shankar, and so he's very much connected to the '60s and sort of Monterey, isn't he? And then sort of, I suppose what I sort of thought about with people like Ravi Shankar and Fela Kuti is that there's an added element to people who really pick up on these artists, because there's a sort of much more of a political edge or a spiritual edge. Did you sort of find that with, you know, the appeal that some people have? They like to identify with an artist. So if you like Gil Scott-Heron, you're bound to like Fela Kuti, and then you're going to like Tony Allen, and you're going to want to there's a lot of identifying with kind of the generalization of world music. Is that something you've...
Well, I think it's true of any artist. I think, the political edge of Fela Kuti is not that different from the political edge of early Bob Dylan at a certain point before he, started writing about Mr. Tambourine Man. But there, Billy Bragg, there's always been artists who are more political, have an edge to them. And So I don't think that, but I do think that for a lot of people, Indian music for sure was connected to a spiritual quest. That there is something very spiritual about. I mean, Indian music is, in its origin, way back in the midst of time, is temple music.
Yes.
And it used to be played in the temples, and it developed that way before it got moved into the palaces and eventually to the concert halls. But it does have a very strong spiritual element, and I think, for a lot of people, they want to. I think, I don't know. I think music from other cultures has a very strong spiritual or psychological effect on people. I mean, we like to think, we don't always, it's not always obvious, that being open to music from another culture makes people open to the people of another
Mm.
culture and more tolerant and more accepting and more, more loving towards mankind in general, more so than heavy metal, maybe.
Yes.
And that's a bit of a rash generalization, which probably, I'm sure some people would dispute. And there's certainly plenty. I mean, the skinheads, the way they loved ska in the 60s and would embrace, Prince Buster, and then go out and beat up a West Indian who they ran into on
Yes.
the street. Sort
Confusing.
of disproves the theory, but still, I think that in some cases you can make that case.
It's interesting because you mentioned, I mean, I think there was a lot of musical snobbery about things like heavy metal, but then more and more we sort of can see something quite skillful. But I always remember Ritchie Blackmore on one of those classic album series talking about being very keen on Bulgarian music and realizing that he'd, was listening to guitar work that he would then bring onto from an acoustic guitar or instrument into an electric guitar, and some of those riffs that probably became very famous kind of have their roots in him listening to very obscure Bulgarian folk music. And I know Tommy Iommi from Black Sabbath, it was Django Reinhardt that was his kind of inspiration for playing when he lost his fingers. And he obviously listened a lot to the work of, Django Reinhardt. So it's kind of interesting. But I've always liked those kind of moments, like Kate Bush suddenly brought an album out, I think it was Sensual World, with Bulgarian folk choir, and that's something that you also bring out in the book as well, these kind of musicians who introduce audiences to bands or artists that you'd never have found individually, but through their work, they bring a bigger, they get to a larger audience in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's there was, the Bulgarian connection goes way back. I mean, if you listen to what's it called, something Rainy Night, track by Joni Mitchell,
Oh yes.
she recreates the sound of Bulgarian choirs by multi-tracking her own voice. And David Crosby, who of course was, very close to Joni Mitchell at one point, he's always said that a lot of his ideas for those weird harmonies that he added to the Byrds and to CSNY came from listening to the Bulgarian Women's Choir, and which he loved. And he also was very influenced by Ravi Shankar. He loved Ravi Shankar, and so it's a sort of, I suppose, cultural trickle down. That a lot of the artists will, as you describe, heavy metal guitar players or whatever, listening to Django and Ravi and Bulgarian music and all this, and then injecting it into their music and giving it something different, something fresh, something. But of course, I think you could probably lock up 1,000 Black Sabbath fans and put them to torture, and none of them would know, or that Bulgarian music was involved, or Django Reinhardt was involved in the music that they loved. None of them would ever say that because they wouldn't know. and to them it's just, you know, it was just kind of cool music to listen to. And
Yes.
so I don't know how music that it's always, I'm sort of bemused at the idea that Black Sabbath were big Django Reinhardt fans, just because I think you could listen to a lot of Black Sabbath without ever guessing that.
No, but interested on that. If you ever get a chance on the classic albums series, which is it is always fascinating. But I know the bass player, who I can't remember his name, but one of the songs came from the Planets. He would be listening to the Planets, and from that brings the idea of yes, one of the tracks from one of those very early albums, which again is, I think it's called Planet. I don't know, something, I can't remember the song, but it's quite, for me, I love listening to those connections of what someone might have been listening to, because they probably weren't listening to heavy rock when they were making an album or the music that they were trying to make. They were probably trying to listen to something completely different while being a bit stoned. And then something subconsciously comes up for them to
Yeah.
make a sound.
Well, but
So
it also goes to prove the basic point, one of the points I make in the book. There is no such thing as pure music. All music is connected, is influenced by other music. And it used to be in the days before media, modern media, it used to be because there were a band of Romas would come through town and people would learn from that and they would learn from the local music. Or a bunch of Portuguese slave traders would capture a bunch of Africans in Congo and put them in chains and take them to Cuba and Brazil, where they would learn Spanish music and come up with something that was a mixture. And it became very powerful and very magnetic and very astonishing to Europeans when they heard it. And you know, so the same thing. And then of course it all changed with the arrival of the record player. So that even though Hawaii was not a place that many people went, but Hawaiian records of Hawaiian guitar spread all over the world. And you had people starting to use the slide and the bottleneck and all these things to make these effects that are basically Hawaiian,
yes.
that have become essential parts of blues and Indian music and all kinds of things. And it's all a mix. You know, there is not this idea that there can be some pure nationalism, some pure identity of a nation in its music is nonsense.
Well,
There is no such
absolutely.
thing.
But it's interesting about, because you obviously talk a lot about Chris Blackwell and then Bob Marley and reggae, because again, it was one of those things in the 80s. Then a lot of those British reggae bands like Aswad and Misty and Roots and Burning Spear kind of have come out. And then again, there's sort of John Peel thing, but there's also, you know, those record labels I mentioned earlier. But there's like the live music scene, you know, the college circuit, as well as people like Sly and Robbie and the Taxi Gang. It gave sort of people another insight to enjoying other cultures and sort of being able to, I mean, what do they call it now? Probably cultural appropriation. But it's a tricky one, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
that kind of thing about, you know, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But at the same time, it allowed people an insight into something they might have been a bit naive about. Because I remember going to those gigs and people were talking about jar love and jar this, but you thought, I have no idea what we're sort of talking about. But it all sounds very cool and groovy, man. But it also goes with, you know, like just wanting to discover new sounds.
Yeah. I mean, musicians, in my experience, never talk about cultural appropriation. It's
Right.
only people standing on the sidelines that make those sort of comments. Um, Most musicians understand that everybody borrows, everybody steals. Everybody, you know, you hear a lick from Russian or Polish music, and it suddenly is injected into a jazz solo. And then you hear a jazz solo in Africa, and it's adapted for a guitar for a dance track in Tanzania. And you hear, you know, some modal scale from Tanzania that inspires a Brazilian artist to do something adventurous, and it just never stops. The whole thing goes around in circles all the time, and I don't think you can. Um, and I think certainly the artists that I worked with from Africa, from Eastern Europe, from Spain, from Cuba, from Brazil, loved playing for foreign audiences. They loved coming to London or Paris or New York and playing for new audiences and meeting other musicians and sharing ideas and recognizing something Brazilian and something they hear that's supposedly English. And they don't say, oh, they stole that. No, they say, oh, wow, how cool. They used it in an interesting way.
Yes. Well, I always thought Elvis Costello was amazingly cool when someone was trying to encourage him to sue somebody like Olivia Rodriguez, because she's a riff that sounds very like Pump It Up. And he said, well, I stole that from Buddy Holly, so I'm not going to worry about it. It's like, and I thought that was nice because up to then, there was always the court case, and and it all felt very grubby, and he just completely killed the conversation dead and just said, yes, well, I've stolen that, so don't worry, and let's move on. And I think that's quite amazing. There was with kind of real world records during that period, there was like there was a sort of interest. I mean, I remember, again, I suppose friends and such like were getting into things like djembe drumming. There was people getting into didgeridoos. They'd go to a festival, they would sort of sit around a drum circle. They would love that. They would have a go with the didgeridoo. There was also Norwegian kind of people like Jan Garbrick and Mari Boyne or something like that.
Yeah.
Did you sort of, you don't mention them particularly in your book, the Norwegian scene, do you?
Well, I mean, the book, the chapters in the book are pretty much, I decided what I was going to write about 17 years ago when I started writing the book. And I never really changed my approach, which was to write about the hits, the stuff that really came across in a big way to the so-called Western audience, meaning salsa, tango, samba, flamenco, Indian music, African music. And, I love Scandinavian music. I would have loved to have written about Rembetiko from Greece, or Fado from Portugal, or Okinawan music, which is fantastic, wonderful stuff. And they all have great stories. But the only way I really get into the Scandinavian music is I talk about at the very end of the book. One of my favorite things, what I sometimes play when I do talks, I talk about the way everything, you'd be amazed at what influences what. And a lot of people don't know. I had some relatives, a young great niece, who was in town. And what are we going to do with her? Oh, let's go to see the ABBA show, the Avatars.
Yes.
In East London. So we went to the ABBA show. And I just was so amused by the fact that here are these electronic images of ABBA performing every night in front of 4,000 people or whatever it is. And ABBA sitting there collecting the money without having to do anything. But Benny Andersson, what he's doing every night, he's out with his band in northern Sweden, playing the accordion with a fiddle band, doing Swedish folk music. He's always loved Swedish traditional music, and he still plays it. And I have recordings of him with that band. And so in my talk, sometimes I play, a waltz by Orsa Spellman, which is his group. And people are amazed because it's very folky and it's very, sort of rustic Scandinavian music. But you can hear ABBA in it.
Right.
You can hear how influenced they were by the way of the chords change in Swedish traditional music is the way chords change in ABBA. It's one of the things that made them so distinctive was the way they have these very Scandinavian chord progressions. So anyway, it's just everywhere you turn, you get sort of further evidence of the kind of thing that I'm talking about.
Yes, well, Sweden's quite famous for sort of the hit machine because there's a guy called Max Martin, isn't there, who's one of those kind of people who's a successful songwriter and producer who's written
Who's that?
for
What's his name?
Max Martin. So he's written for people like Britney Spears and Taylor Swift.
Oh, okay,
and,
okay.
You know, so, and Sweden has got a history of, well, quite a relatively new history of being able to develop a sound
Right.
that is just very successful. But obviously the DNA goes back to what you were saying about with
Yeah.
Benny is probably there's something kind of unique that we can't quite catch, but they've obviously become very successful doing it. So yes, that's always. But yeah, so did you enjoy your ABBA experience, or was it just too weird? And
I like ABBA a lot. I have a greatest hits album, and I really enjoy their music. I was a little disappointed, mainly because what I eventually figured out was that what they do technically in that show is they've stripped out the backing from the original recordings. They've kept the vocals, and the avatars sing the vocals. And it's perfectly synced up, and it's very seamless. You don't sort of worry about a gap in timing or anything like that. But they have a live band, and the live band has a click track
right,
from the original recording. And the original recording is gone, and the live band is playing the backing. And I guess they think it gives more energy and more of a live feel. But the arrangements are much heavier. They're much more dance heavy, very big sound on the bass drum. All the modern effects that you get at a live show today are there. And the band is good, but they're not ABBA.
no,
They don't sound like ABBA. They sound more like today. And so that was a bit boring once I realized what was happening because I was frustrated. I wasn't hearing the records sounding the way I remembered them. And they're pretty, they don't change them radically. It's just the mix and the attack on all the instruments is much more heavier and more aggressive. And it's more to get across to an audience who's,
yes. Well, I just watched on the iPlayer. There's a couple of documentaries, which I love music documentaries, and there was two on ABBA. One, ABBA when they came to Britain, and another one, the history of ABBA, and it goes into the whole history of the all their solo work before they became ABBA, and their famous Eurovision Song Contest in Brighton in 1974, and how they developed. But
what's that documentary called?
Well, if you go to the BBC iPlayer and look at the music documentaries, there's two on ABBA. There's like Live at the BBC, which is probably tedious, but there's the two, which is like when ABBA comes to Britain, but there's another one, which is the kind of history. And it's quite nice because that particular one has recordings on cheap cassettes of them doing interviews at that time, reflecting on what they're doing. So you get a sense of them. And they're absolutely, I didn't realise, I suppose, talking about ABBA, that they were such a real band, just endlessly touring, endlessly recording, breaking it in, Australia, flopping in America. The marriages were all going down the pan, and they were still having to sort of bring out the next album, and then they get to the end, don't they, where it's kind of all over, and you can see them sitting there looking like a shell. They're just not with it at all. And and I loved ABBA when I was younger, but obviously, you miss it during your later years, and then you start to appreciate them again. And I thought, yeah, that's quite amazing, really. So,
Yeah, no, they're wonderful.
yes, and just also talking of fantastic films, there was one called When We Were Kings, which was the Rumble in the Jungle, and that
Yeah.
one about Zaire in 1974. And again, I mean, when you talk about sort of being introduced to world music, again, that had an amazing soundtrack, but also the political side of Zaire. President, was it
Yeah,
Mobutu at that
Mobutu,
time?
yeah.
So did you, I mean, writing this book, coming back to the book, did you really enjoy that sense of research and discovery?
Yeah, no, I did a lot. I mean, I did a lot of reading, and I loved discovering that story because When We Were Kings, came out in the 90s, or late 80s or 90s or whatever, and won an Oscar for best documentary. But that was about the fight.
Yes.
And I had seen Soul Power, which didn't come out till 2003 or something, which is the film about the music that was the music festival that was supposed to be in conjunction with the fight. And it turns out to be this sinisterly hilarious farrago of cocaine crazed hubris that
Very stoned.
yeah. It was just such a mess because they contracted all these artists, James Brown, the Fania All Stars,
B.B.
all
King.
these,
There was one called, is it Miriam Man?
Miriam Makeba.
Yes.
Miriam Makeba, she was there, and also what's his name, Grandma's Hands,
And B.B. King, I think, was there.
No, yeah, B.B. King was there, but this other guy who was huge at the time, and they contracted them all, and they were booked to fly in and do this huge concert, and what's the defending champion cut his eye.
Oh, yes, there was.
And so the fight had to be postponed by 6 weeks, but the concert couldn't be. So they held the concert in a vacuum, and they knew that Africans didn't have much money. They just said, let's be really reasonable and only charge $10 for tickets. And they had all this investment from some dodgy connection in Liberia. And Mobutu heard that they were charging $10 for the ticket. And he knew that nobody in Kinshasa could afford $10 for a ticket. And they couldn't even afford $1.
Right.
And so he issued an edict declaring the concert free. And so these guys who'd taken like millions of dollars from this illegal mining executive from Liberia, had no way to recoup the money because they were supposed to. Don King said he was going to sell worldwide rights. It was going to be bigger than Woodstock. Nobody knew it happened. It just sank without trace, but they filmed it. And the guy who filmed it got intrigued with the whole scene. And when all the music people just got out of town as fast as they could after the show, and he stayed and persuaded them to let him film the fight and the stuff surrounding the fight. And that is When We Were Kings.
Right.
And he won an Oscar for that. Anyway, there's so many, everywhere you look in research, there's great stories.
Yes, no, that was, again, because there was various musicians on that bill that I'd never come across before. But then again, it's that thing about discovering another artist and another way in, which I suppose is always what we all sort of love to do so much, actually, on that front. So, yes, it was Joe Fraser who was the defending champion.
No, it wasn't Joe Fraser. It was
Muhammad Ali. I thought
Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman.
George Foreman, God, of course. Sorry. Yes, there you go.
Yeah,
I know.
Joe Fraser was gone by then.
He was sadly gone. But yes, well, look, thank you ever so much for your time. And with the book, I guess you're doing lots of readings. I mean, this is quite an extraordinary piece of work. Is there any projects you got lined up next after this?
Well, I'm doing a lot of promoting the book, and I'm going to start doing some kind of radio show. I'm not sure. I'm still looking at different options for where I'll do it, how I'll do it. But to play my record collection and, rabble on about the tracks I'm playing, and play the kind of stuff I write about in the book, but also the kind of stuff I write about in the other book.
White bicycles?
Yeah, so it won't be a world music show as such. It'll be, a bit of everything. But that's not a concrete. That's just a gleam in the eye at the moment.
Because I heard you on this latest one with Stuart Lee talk about the 60s and Shirley Collins and Bob Dylan locking himself in the toilet when he sort of wasn't going down terribly well in London, I guess. I don't think Shirley was very impressed. And I think, yes, that was as you mentioned at the beginning, the 60s began very much with that folk scene before turning electric during the mid-60s. So, yes, that'll be interesting. I've only heard the first, they've only released the first one so far, so it'll be interesting to hear the rest of it. And I guess you appear with the UFO Club, don't you?
I will.
And did they ever make a film about Hoppy Hopkins, by the way?
There's a film about Hoppy that's been made. It's now being re-edited. Unfortunately, I was out of London. They had a screening a year ago, just to some friends. And then the director felt after the screening that he needed to re-edit.
Right.
So it's being worked on, and hopefully will be come out sometime next year.
Yes, and sort of because obviously some people came out of that period well, some people didn't. How do you sort of, reflecting back, feel about some of the things that happened during that time? Because Hoppy didn't really survive that period so well, did he?
Well, I mean, Hoppy was very demoralized by his time in prison. He was. The police were out to get him. They viewed him correctly as the Pied Piper of the underground. He was a very charismatic, fantastic guy. And people loved him. And he had a way of leading that was just wonderful. And he, right at the height of it all, right after Sergeant Pepper was released, he was sentenced to 8 months in Wormwood Scrubs. I think he served 5 or 6 months.
Right.
And when he came out, by that time, UFO had shut down. And he went off to Morocco for a month or something. And when he came back, he just kept a really low profile and started doing a different kind of work. And we stayed friends, and we were, I saw him up to the very last when he died. And he was a wonderful guy, but he told me that prison kind of knocked the stuffing out of him.
Yes.
That it really rattled his confidence. And he wasn't really the same. He was the same person in many, many ways, but he didn't have the same drive to lead that he had before.
And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Joe Boyd for giving me the time for that. As I said, he's got a new book that's just come out, which is, again, titled And the Roots of Rhythm Remain, on Faber and Faber. This has been the C86 show, David Eastaugh. So if you want to contact me, you can on any of the social media platform sites. Just do C86 show. And also, all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.